And he was on record as saying he would veto a bill that would come to his desk concerning a central bank. He was a Republican and was surely to be elected to a second term in 1912. So William Howard Taft was the president, but he wouldn't go along with the scheme. So in the Republican primary, Teddy Roosevelt, anybody remember him? Teddy Roosevelt ran against Taft in the Republican primary. He was backed by this group of bankers, but he lost in the Republican primary. Listen to this. So they decided they'd have to do something about the regular election. So what did they do? They went and got Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, to enter the presidential race against Taft, a Republican, so that the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, who had pledged he would sign the bill, the Republicans would divide their vote and therefore Woodrow Wilson would be elected with less than a majority vote. Couldn't beat Taft on his own, so then they financed Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, to run two Republicans in the presidential election, dividing the Republican vote. It's not about Republican or Democrat. I'm simply telling you how these people are able to manipulate the system. So their millions back a candidate, knowing that he's not going to be elected, so that their man can get elected because he will pass the legislation to the central bank. He was elected by less than a majority vote, and the Federal Reserve System came into being. Hello? Watch this. Here's how it works. They print it, we borrow it, and we pay them interest. This is a private company, privately held. They have to pay for postage stamps. They are that far away from the federal government. This is an independent corporation and group of bankers. So when you hear the news say, the Fed decided that the interest rate will go up, how do they get to decide? They get to decide because in 1913, Woodrow Wilson, he was inaugurated in January of 1913. In December of 1913, he signed the Federal Reserve Act, bringing the Federal Reserve System into place in America, and did what Thomas Jefferson said must never happen. He took the control of the money away from the people by taking it away from the Congress and gave it to a group of private individuals who have to pay taxes on the money they loan the government. Here's how it works. Here's how it works. Let's say the government, which always needs money because it always spends more than it is able to collect in taxes. So the federal government needs $1 billion. Since they gave away their ability to create the money, they have to go to the creators. The creators of the money, according to the legislation passed in 1913. Incidentally, the Federal Reserve Board has been in operation in this country since 1913. They have never been audited one time. Do you see that we've been taken captive? That's all I'm trying to... My whole point, somebody asked me, Pastor, why are you sharing that? My whole point is to let you know you're in bondage and don't know it. You're serving two masters and you don't know it. They are using you and you don't know it. So since the government needs $1 billion, since they can't create the money, because in 1913 they gave that responsibility and they gave that authority to the Federal Reserve, they have to go to, our government has to go to the Federal Reserve and ask them for the $1 billion. Well, since the Federal Reserve is a private corporation, they're not about ready to just give their money away. So they say to the government, we will loan you the $1 billion for your agreement to pay it back with interest. But now wait a minute. The government doesn't have the ability to create the money. The Federal Reserve creates the money. So the Federal Reserve, through legislation in Congress, not that they control it, but for the actual printing of the money, that's the only thing we have the ability to do. Congress tells the Treasury Department, the Fed will loan us $1 billion, print $1 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. So for $1,000, they print $1 billion of bills, of bonds. Those bonds are given to the Federal Reserve, $1 billion. Now the Federal Reserve in bonds plus interest. The Federal Reserve then gives the bonds to the government to pay its bills. But watch me, because you're not thinking. The government needed $1 billion. They borrowed $1 billion. But the Federal Reserve said, we'll loan you the $1 billion plus interest. But it only prints the $1 billion. So the interest payments are never created and put into the system. So how is the government ever going to pay them back? They didn't have the $1 billion to begin with. If they didn't have the billion, then they didn't have the billion plus interest. So they get given the billion, but they can't pay the interest because the interest money was never created and put in the system. That's how it's growing $1.6 billion a day. We can't pay the interest. The money is not in the system. But what about you? Oh, it gets worse than that. It gets worse than that. Let's take that $1 billion. Legislation has been created that the Federal Reserve, having that $1 billion of Treasury bonds sitting in its belly at interest, can lend, as a result of having that $1 billion, they can lend $15 billion. Wait. Paper money. Credit. No, there's no substance. There's nothing backing it. But they can come to you and say, we will loan you $15 billion on credit because we have $1 billion that we created and had the government give back to us. Now we can loan $15 billion. That $15 billion plus the one is $16 billion in that one transaction, of which there are thousands. That one transaction where they've got $16 billion out there that people are paying them in interest that in reality the money doesn't even exist. But what does exist is your money that they take and they take and they take and they take and they take. And we wonder why bankruptcies were more in the first 3 months of 2003 than in the history of this country. Is there a reason for that? Yes, it's called credit. It's called debt. How many of you agree that's awful and that shouldn't be? They shouldn't be able to, put in $1 billion and take out the billion plus the interest money, because more is being taken out of the system than is put in the system, keeping the people enslaved to the tune of $7 trillion in national debt alone. That doesn't include state debt. That doesn't include municipality debt. It doesn't include personal debt. That's just the federal debt. That's just what we borrowed from the Federal Reserve that we can't pay back. Are you ready? How many of you agree that's awful? Okay, what about you? Let's see. You can never get out of debt in a usury system with a built-in shortage of money. Did you hear me? Now watch. Let's say you're going to buy a house. Let's say that house is $150,000. And let's say current rate today is 7%. You do understand that by the end of that 30-year mortgage,